So welcome again. In this lesson, we are going to talk about selectors and class types. So selectors are essentially a way for us to find out if a certain object can respond to a certain function. And class type is essentially used to find out the type of the class that has made this current object. Essentially a way to find out which class has instantiated this particular object. Now let's go to Xcode and get this done. And just so that every once in a while we go back to the whole Objective-C mode, I'm gonna do both of these in Objective-C this time. So in Xcode, I'm gonna go ahead and say, give me a new command line tool in Objective-C, and it is called Selectors, Objective-C. Now in my .m, I'm gonna go ahead and say, I have something called NSMutableArray called my array, which is NSMutableArray new. It's just a brand new allocated and initialized array. Then I'm going to go ahead and do this. I'm going to say my array perform selector with object, and the selector that I want to apply to it is called @selector. That is called add object, for instance. And the object I want to add is perhaps my name. That's all I want to do in here. Now, you might be asking yourself, so is this a safe way of doing it? Are you just assuming that mutable array, no matter what, can take add object to it? And the answer to that is no. It actually is not a very safe way of doing it. A much safer way would be this. If I said if my array responds to selector, and the selector that I want to use is called @selector add object. If that is true, then I want to do this whole thing. Otherwise, I don't want to do anything. So that's about that. If my array responds to this selector, then do that thing. Add to it, for instance, a value. And that's pretty much all there is to a selector. In the past, you have seen selectors that I added on buttons. For instance, I said my button add target. Target was self with selector, and the selector was @selector name of function, so on and so forth. And that's how we use selectors to make sure that something does respond to a certain function. Now, a much bigger question for you might be, so I know this is an array and I know it can have add object. So what's the point of using this? So the answer to that would be in a situation like this, when we have an array of objects that we don't know what they are. So let's go ahead and make that. And I'm actually going to make this a slightly more a broader application, so I can use it for class type as well. So I'm going to go ahead and say Command N, and I'm going to make a Coco class of the type NSObject, language is Objective-C, and I'm going to call it car. So I have a .h and a .m for a car, and I also have a .h and a .m for a person, and I have a last Command M, a .h and a .m for, let's say, a building. So cars, buildings, and people. And we have 3 classes in here. Now I'm going to go do some cleanup in all of those so that things are a lot easier for us to see and to understand. In the .m's I don't have anything. In the .h's again I'm going to remove the nullable begin, and then the same thing in here. This is going to be rather simple, so don't worry about having too many files and everything. It's going to be much easier. So the first thing I want to do is I want to go to the car.h and say every one of these classes, they have a method called locate. So that's essentially going to place my objects, my cars, my people, my whatever, in some place. Also, cars, they have something called change gear. Not like that. Not like that. Change gear. So they have 2 methods. I'm going to copy that. I'm going to go to my .m. Doesn't have to have an actual implementation as long as we have the curly brackets. So that's that. I'm going to go to my person and say, well, my person does have a locate, but cannot change gear, but can eat. So I'm going to copy these 2 and go to my person.m and say, do the same thing, have a body for the functions so I don't get an error. I'm going to go to the building. The buildings, they have a locate, and they cannot have something that does it, but they can have something called lights on. The lights, they turn on them. I'm going to copy those and go to the .m. And of course the same thing as always. So now I have three classes that the three of them, they have a method in them called locate, but each of them has one extra method as well, eat, and the other one lights on. Now I'm going to go to my .m and I'm going to import all three of them. I'm going to say import, and what I want to import is car, and I want to go ahead and say building, and I want to go ahead and say person. So all three of them are added in here. And in my array, before I do any of these things, I'm going to go ahead and make three copies. I'm going to say car, let's say Jeep is going to be car new. So I have one Jeep. I'm going to copy this twice, even though that was not a very good idea. Person, myself is person new. Building, let's call it Empire State. I don't know the name of any buildings, to be honest. All the buildings are numbered, like the number 226 or whatever. So that's about that. So I have a car, I have a person, and I have a building, and they're all added to my array. Just so that I can make things easier, I'm going to cut them up here, paste them in here, and say alloc and init with objects. And the objects are Jeep, Amir, and Empire State Building. Perfect. So now I have an array with mixed objects that I don't know what they are, and I don't know, what do they actually, what can they do. So now I could go ahead and say for int I is 0, I is smaller than my array dot count, and then I plus plus, do this. What am I going to do? I'm going to say if my array object at index I responds to selector, and let's say the selector that I want to use is it. If it does respond to it, which is this, then it. So while this example may not really do anything for us, it explains to you why we would end up using selectors. We use it for when we don't know what the object is, what is it capable of, what it might be used for, and whether they do respond to a certain selector or they don't. So while we are here, let me run another for loop that's going to tell us what is the class of each of the guys in my array. So I'm going to go ahead and say for. Now here's a very interesting thing. I don't want to use a numeric for loop. I want to use a for in loop. Usually we say for NSS string, for instance, each in my array, or so on and so forth. But I know the objects in my array are not NSS string. Not only that, they could be anything. So in a situation like that, I'm going to say, well, for ID each in my array, it means go through the array irrelevant of what is inside them. I'm going to say for ID each in my array. Let's do this. If, what is the if for? Each is kind of class, and what's the class that we are looking for? The class is going to be, let's say I'm looking for the ones that are of the type building. I'm going to say building class. If they are of the type building class, here you can do whatever you want to do with the building. For instance, building turn lights on, or anything to that effect. So that's about that. So we managed to have a respond to selectors to find out if these objects respond to a certain thing. And we managed to get the kind of the class that any object is. And then depending on that, we will end up doing things. You could do whether it is or whether it is not, if you want to filter certain objects out. And it's sometimes useful to know what's the kind of the class that you are the object that you're dealing with. So that's about that for selectors and its kind of class, and let's move on.